In January 1978, someone made the last mistake of their life. It happened in River Forest, Illinois, a quiet, wealthy suburb on the western edge of Chicago, the kind of place where judges lived, where corporate executives raised their children, where nothing violent had ever happened in living memory. In the dead of night, in the grip of the worst blizzard in Chicago's recorded history, with wind chills at 40 below zero and snow burying cars whole, in that frozen silence, a group of professional thieves broke into a house. Not just any house. They broke into Tony Accardo's house, the man who had run the Chicago outfit for 40 years, who had learned the criminal trade at the knee of Al Capone himself, who had built an empire worth hundreds of millions stretching from Chicago to Las Vegas, and who, in 60 years of trying, the federal government had never once managed to put behind bars for a single night. That man's house. They ransacked it, took his jewelry, his cash, his gold cufflinks. One of them was later spotted around Chicago, actually wearing those cufflinks in public. Accardo was 71 years old and vacationing in California when he got the call. He listened quietly, asked a few questions, put down the phone, and then, over the next 10 months, every single person connected to that burglary turned up dead. Not just the thieves, the getaway drivers, the fences, the men who had simply known about the job in advance and said nothing. 10 people total, killed in a sequence so methodical it read less like revenge and more like a man quietly erasing a sentence from a document, removing every word until the page was clean. Then, when the killings were done, he killed the killers too. The case went officially unsolved for 24 years. And here's what makes Tony Accardo unlike anyone else in the history of American crime. He walked away from all of it, the burglary, the 10 murders, 6 decades of running a criminal empire, completely free. No prison, not one night behind bars. Ever. While Al Capone died broken at 48. While John Gotti died in a federal prison cell. While Sam Giancana was shot 7 times in his own kitchen. Tony Accardo died peacefully in his own bed at 86, surrounded by his family. This is a story of how. Before we dive into the depth of Accardo's world, I'm curious. Where in the world are you watching from tonight? Drop your city in the comments below. And what time is it where you are? 2 a.m.? Perfect. There's something magical about crime stories in the dead of night. If you're new here, welcome to our family of night owls and crime enthusiasts. Hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. We post these long-form stories every day, perfect for your late-night listening. And if you're already part of our community, show some love with a like. It helps more people discover these untold stories. Now, settle in. Get comfortable. This is a complete, unfiltered story of Tony Accardo, a journey through Chicago's criminal underworld. Let's begin. The year was 1905, somewhere in the Atlantic. Aboard a vessel called the Sicilian Prince, a young couple from the province of Trapani, Sicily, stood at the railing and watched the line of the American coastline grow closer. Francesco Accardo was a shoemaker by trade, a craftsman, a man who worked with his hands and understood the simple dignity of making something useful out of raw material. His wife, Maria Tillota Accardo, was a homemaker, and she carried inside her the beginning of what would become one of the most consequential criminal careers in the 20th century, though of course she could not have known that then. They came from Castelvetrano, a small town in western Sicily that had been shaped over centuries by poverty and the particular Sicilian understanding that the law, the official law, the government's law, was not necessarily the same thing as justice. Castelvetrano would later become famous as the hometown of Salvatore Giuliano, the Sicilian bandit who became a folk hero in the years after World War II. But in 1905, it was simply one of countless small Sicilian towns from which thousands of families were departing for the Americas, fleeing agricultural collapse, feudal landholding systems, and the grinding poverty that had characterized southern Italian life for generations. The Accardos arrived in Chicago and settled on the near west side, in the neighborhood that locals called Little Sicily. This was not a neighborhood in the romantic, picture postcard sense that some later narratives would paint it. Little Sicily in the early years of the 20th century was a dense, noisy, sometimes dangerous enclave of immigrants who had packed themselves into tenement buildings along streets like Galt Court, carrying with them the social codes and clan loyalties of the old country, and finding that in America those codes had to be adapted to survive in a very different world. The streets smelled of garlic and horse manure, of tallow candles and coal smoke. Children played in alleys between buildings where laundry hung on lines strung between windows. Men gathered on stoops in the evenings, speaking in Sicilian dialect, reading Italian-language newspapers, arguing about American politics they were only beginning to understand. Women went to Mass at the local parish church. The shoemakers and tailors and fruit peddlers of Little Sicily were building something that looked, from a certain distance, like a community, and in many ways it was. But beneath the surface, the neighborhood was also structured by older, darker hierarchies. Into this world, on April 28, 1906, was born Antonino Leonardo Accardo, the second of 6 children. He would be baptized in the Catholic faith, raised in a household where Sunday Mass was not optional, where family loyalty was the first and greatest commandment, and where the hardships of immigrant life in America were met with a combination of stoicism and resourcefulness that had been bred into Sicilians over centuries. Francesco Accardo's cobbler shop provided a modest living, not comfortable, but not desperate either. The family had shoes on their feet, food on the table, and the children went to school. Tony attended James Otis Elementary School beginning in 1911, and then moved on to Washington Grade School. He was, by all accounts, not a particularly academic child. The classroom held no fascination for him. What fascinated him was the street. The street taught Tony Accardo things that no classroom ever could, and it taught them efficiently. By the time he was 14, he had absorbed the fundamental lesson that would define his entire life, that power and money moved through networks of loyalty and fear, and that the official world, the world of school certificates and legitimate employment, was a secondary system, something maintained largely for appearances. In 1920, his parents made an unusual decision. They filed a delayed birth certificate that listed Tony's birth year as 1904 rather than 1906, making him officially 16 rather than 14. This allowed him to legally leave school. The minimum leaving age was 16, and Tony departed the educational system without ceremony and without regret. He was 14 years old and considered himself finished with formal education. The streets would complete what the classroom had begun. What came next was a predictable trajectory of a young man in Little Sicily with no particular interest in legal employment. Tony began loitering around the neighborhood pool halls, places where men gathered not merely to play billiards but to exchange information, conduct small transactions, and absorb the social grammar of the underworld. He started out as a pickpocket, moved to stealing cars, ran with a loose collection of neighborhood toughs who robbed stores when they thought they could get away with it, and occasionally did not get away with it. His first arrest came in 1922, when he was 16 years old. It would not be his last arrest, not by a long measure. Over the course of his life, Tony Accardo would accumulate more than 30 arrests on charges ranging from murder to kidnapping to extortion to tax fraud to contempt of Congress. He would face federal grand juries, Senate subcommittees, and the sustained investigative attention of the FBI's most dedicated agents. And through all of it, he would never be successfully convicted of a serious crime that put him behind bars for any meaningful period. But that is the end of the story. In 1922, he was just another young tough from Little Sicily, getting his shoes dirty on Chicago's unforgiving pavement. The key to understanding Tony Accardo's early criminal development is to understand the world that Chicago was in the early 1920s. Prohibition had been in effect since January 1920, when the 18th Amendment to the Constitution and the Volstead Act made it illegal to manufacture, transport, or sell alcoholic beverages in the United States. For most Americans, Prohibition was a social experiment that failed. For a certain class of opportunistic and ruthless men, it was the greatest business opportunity in American history. Chicago in the early 1920s was a city in the process of being organized crime, that is, in the most literal sense. The bootlegging business required logistics, supply chains, distribution networks, enforcement mechanisms, and political protection. It required, in short, everything that a legitimate large-scale business requires, plus the willingness to commit violence against competitors. The men who grasped this reality and acted on it accumulated wealth and power at a rate that legitimate businessmen of the era could only marvel at. The man who was in the process of grasping all of this most completely in 1922 and 1923 was Alphonse Gabriel Capone. Al Capone had arrived in Chicago from Brooklyn, sent there by the New York racketeer Johnny Torrio, who had himself come to Chicago to work for his uncle, a gambler and saloon keeper named Big Jim Colosimo. Torrio eventually had Colosimo killed when the older man proved too conservative about expanding into bootlegging, a decision that revealed both Torrio's ruthlessness and his business acumen. Torrio then built, with Capone as his increasingly powerful lieutenant, a criminal organization of unprecedented scale in Chicago. Into this world, the Circus Cafe gang served as an entry point. The Circus Cafe was a place on North Avenue, run by a man named Claude Maddox, whose real name was John Edward Moore, and associated with gambler and street boss named Tony Capizio. The Circus Cafe gang that operated out of this establishment was, to use a term that would later be applied to it, a talent pool. It was one of several such gangs operating in Chicago's impoverished neighborhoods, serving essentially the same function that a minor league baseball team serves relative to a major league franchise. Young men with criminal talent and potential were recruited, tested, given progressively more significant assignments, and the best of them were eventually elevated into the larger organization. Tony Accardo found his way to the Circus Cafe gang in the early 1920s, likely through Tony Capizio, who had spotted the young man's qualities, his physical courage, his calm under pressure, his capacity for disciplined violence, and recognized that these were commodities worth cultivating. The gang's activities ran the full spectrum of small-time criminality. They distributed bootleg liquor, ran gambling operations, collected debts, and performed the kind of violent enforcement work that the larger Capone organization sometimes needed done at arm's length. Tony Accardo, still a teenager, proved himself in this environment quickly. He was not reckless in the way that many young men in his position were. The kind of recklessness that gets a man killed or arrested before he has a chance to amount to anything. He was thoughtful in a way that seemed almost innate, as though he had been born already understanding that the best outcome in a dangerous situation was the one in which you accomplish your objective and left without making unnecessary noise. He was physically imposing, 5 feet 9 inches tall, approximately 200 pounds, built for the kind of work that required both strength and the ability to project menace without always having to use it. The critical moment in Tony Accardo's early criminal career came when he attracted the attention of Jack McGurn. Jack Machine Gun McGurn was one of the most feared and capable hitmen in Al Capone's organization, and finding oneself in his orbit was either a death sentence or a golden ticket, depending entirely on whether McGurn liked what he saw. Born Vincenzo Antonio Gabardi, McGurn had changed his name and built a reputation as one of the most efficient killers in Chicago. He was also, paradoxically, a former amateur boxer with a flair for personal style who always appeared impeccably dressed. McGurn, operating in the same North Side territory where Accardo had been honing his skills, recognized something in the young man from the Circus Cafe gang. He recruited Accardo into his crew in 1926, giving the 20-year-old his first formal connection to the Capone organization. This was a significant step up, from the minor leagues of majors, from petty neighborhood crime to the organized, hierarchical, and vastly more lucrative world of the Chicago outfit. The Chicago outfit at this point in its history was not merely a criminal gang, but something approaching a criminal government. It controlled entire neighborhoods through a combination of corruption and terror. It had relationships with aldermen, judges, police captains, and politicians at every level of Chicago's civic life. It collected tribute, a street tax, from virtually every illegal enterprise operating within its territory, and from a good many legitimate ones as well. It was, in the language that would later be applied to it, a criminal enterprise with complexity and scope of a medium-sized corporation. Tony Accardo entered this world to the front door, with McGurn as a sponsor in 1926, and almost immediately, he began to prove that the investment in him was worthwhile. Early in 1926, Accardo met Al Capone directly and was formally initiated into the Capone organization at the age of 20. He was assigned as Capone's chauffeur and bodyguard, a position of extraordinary trust that put him in close proximity to the most powerful and feared criminal in the country. He spent long hours in the lobby of Capone's suite at the Lexington Hotel on Michigan Avenue, screening visitors, watching the way business was conducted, learning how power was exercised and maintained. He drove Capone to meetings and waited outside. He accompanied the boss to restaurants and social functions, watching the room the way a good bodyguard watches a room, not with visible nervousness, but with quiet, comprehensive attention. What he absorbed during these years was more than practical criminal technique. He absorbed a philosophy. He watched Capone operate, saw the grand gestures and the public flamboyance, but also saw the cost of that flamboyance. He watched how Capone's enemies tried to reach him, and he began to develop his own theory about how a man in Capone's position ought to conduct himself. The theory was essentially the opposite of everything Capone did publicly. In 1929, a story began circulating within the Capone organization that would define Tony Accardo for the rest of his life. The details have been told and retold with varying specifics, but the core of the story is this. Al Capone discovered that 3 members of his own organization had betrayed him. Betrayal, ratting to police, skimming money from operations, dealing with rivals, was the one unforgivable sin in the Capone world, punishable by death. But Capone, on this occasion, had a particular theatrical inclination. He wanted the punishment to serve as a lesson to everyone present. He organized what appeared to be a dinner, a gathering of his men, ostensibly social in nature, the kind of event that the organization held periodically to maintain a sense of eternal cohesion. The 3 traitors were present, presumably unaware of what had been planned. At the appropriate moment in the evening, Tony Accardo produced a baseball bat and administered a brutal beating to each of the 3 men in turn, delivering blows that broke bones and ultimately ended lives. The violence was methodical, efficient, and devastating. When it was finished, Capone reportedly turned to men around the table and said, "Boy, this kid's a real Joe Batters." The nickname stuck with an immediacy that suggested it captured something true about the young man's character. Joe Batters, a man who executed his assignments with thorough, unflinching effectiveness. A man whose instrument of choice told you something important about his relationship to the work. Not a gun, which created distance between the killer and the killed, but bat, which required physical proximity, strength, and the willingness to look at what you were doing. The nickname would follow him his entire life, used by the men who knew him, by FBI reports and court documents. Even decades later, when Accardo had long since graduated from physical enforcement to strategic command, when he sat in the back seat of black Cadillacs and made decisions with nods and whispered conversations rather than with any instrument more violent than a telephone, his men still called him Joe Batters. It was a reminder of who he had been, and perhaps of who he always, at some fundamental level, remained. February 14th, 1929. Valentine's Day. A garage at 2122 North Clark Street on Chicago's North Side. 7 men were killed. 4 of them were members of the North Side Gang, the criminal organization led by George Bugs Moran, Capone's most persistent and dangerous rival. 3 others were associates who had the misfortune of being in the garage that morning. The killers entered dressed as police officers, lined the victims up against the wall, and executed them with shotguns and Thompson submachine guns. The killers then departed, and the true police, arriving later, found a scene of carnage that shocked even hardened Chicago detectives. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre was a defining event of Chicago's gangster era, the moment when the violence of Prohibition-era organized crime crossed a threshold into something that even Chicago's famously tolerant public could no longer ignore. It made national headlines, generated political pressure that would eventually contribute to Capone's downfall, and became permanently embedded in American cultural memory. Was Tony Accardo there? In later years, over federal wiretaps that he presumably did not know were running, Accardo would boast that he had participated in the massacre. This boast has been treated with skepticism by most serious researchers. Most experts believe that the primary gunmen were Capone associates, including Fred Burke and Gus Winkler, men whose physical descriptions and criminal records fit the available evidence more neatly than Accardo's. The consensus among those who have studied the massacre most carefully is that Accardo had, at best, peripheral involvement, perhaps as a lookout or in some supporting role, but was not among the actual shooters. What is documented is that shortly after the massacre, Accardo was seen in the lobby of the Lexington Hotel, Capone's Chicago headquarters, carrying a machine gun. This placed him in the orbit of the event without definitively placing him at the scene. It was a characteristic moment of ambiguity, close enough to suggest involvement, far enough to permit denial. It was, in retrospect, the first glimpse of a pattern that would define his entire career. What is also documented is that on October 11, 1926, 2 years before the massacre, Accardo is believed to have participated in the assassination of Hemi Weiss near the Holy Name Cathedral in Chicago. Weiss was the leader of the North Side Gang's predecessor organization and was Capone's most dangerous adversary at the time. A team of gunmen firing from 2 positions caught Weiss and his companions in a crossfire on the steps of the cathedral. Weiss was killed. Several of his men were wounded. Tony Accardo, 20 years old, is believed to have been one of the gunmen. He was never charged. In 1931, the federal government accomplished what Chicago's gangland wars could not. Al Capone was convicted, not of murder or extortion or bootlegging, but of income tax evasion. The indictment listed 32 counts of failure to pay taxes on income derived from illegal enterprises. Capone was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison and fined $50,000. He would never run the Chicago outfit again. His health deteriorated dramatically during his imprisonment, a syphilitic infection progressing to the point where the man who had once commanded fear with his mere presence was reduced to a confused and diminished shadow of himself by the time he was released. The organization that Capone had built did not collapse with his imprisonment. It adapted. The man placed a nominal charge was Frank the Enforcer Nitti, who had his own history of tax evasion conviction and prison time, but had recovered to become one of Capone's most trusted lieutenants. Nitti was a competent administrator and a capable leader, and under his management the outfit continued to function and profit. For Tony Accardo, Capone's fall was an opportunity. With the boss removed and the organization in transition, capable men who had proven their loyalty and their competence could advance. In 1932, Nitti allowed Accardo to establish his own crew, to become a capo regime, a captain, with his own territory and his own operations to manage and profit from. Accardo was 26 years old, and he was now a boss in his own right within the larger structure of the Chicago outfit. The crew he built was not the flashy, high-profile operation that Capone had run. Accardo's crew was disciplined, businesslike, and relentlessly focused on generating revenue, without generating headlines. He developed gambling operations, loan sharking, bookmaking, and the distribution of untaxed alcohol and cigarettes. As with all captains, he paid a portion of his earnings, a street tax, upward to Nitti, and he collected a street tax from the operations within his own territory. The mathematics of this system, when applied across the full extent of the outfit's Chicago operations, generated enormous sums of money that flowed upward to the organization with reliable efficiency. His crew included 2 men who would become significant figures in Chicago organized crime in their own right. Gussie Alex, who would become one of the most important political fixers in the outfit's history, specializing in corrupting public officials, and Joseph Joey Doves Iuppa, who would eventually serve as a street boss of the outfit under Accardo's overall authority for more than a decade. Accardo was good at this. He had a natural aptitude for the organizational dimensions of criminal enterprise, the management of personnel, the structuring of incentives, the enforcement of rules, the resolution of disputes. He was patient in a way that many of his contemporaries were not. He could absorb an insult or a setback without immediate retaliation, store it, and address it at the most effective moment. He was capable of tremendous violence, as his history demonstrated, but he did not use violence as a first resort the way some of his peers did. He used it as a last resort, and precisely as a tool rather than an outlet. In 1934, Tony Accardo met a woman who would become one of the central facts of his life. Clarice Pordzany was the daughter of Polish immigrants, an unusual choice for a man embedded in the heavily Italian world of Chicago organized crime. And she worked as a chorus girl, a job that in the 1930s carried a certain romantic glamour, even as it suggested a woman unafraid of the spotlight. How exactly Tony Accardo, a man who spent his entire career avoiding spotlights, fell in love with a chorus girl is a question that the historical record does not fully answer. But fall in love he did, and the marriage that followed would last until Clarice's death. They would have 2 daughters and adopt 2 sons over the course of the following years. One of the adopted sons, Anthony Ross Accardo, would later win millions of dollars in the Illinois state lottery, an irony that his father, who had spent his life making large sums of money through illegal means, surely appreciated. But that is a story for another time. What mattered in the 1930s was that Tony Accardo was building two lives simultaneously, with the same careful attention to detail that he brought to every other endeavor. On one side, the husband, the father, the neighbor, the man who went to mass and shook hands with other men from the neighborhood, who was seen at the market and at the parish hall, and who presented to the world outside the outfit the image of a successful businessman. On the other side, the captain, the enforcer, the strategist, the man who made decisions in back rooms and whose name, when it came up in conversations among Chicago's criminal class, produced immediate deference. The double life was not, for Accardo, a source of psychological conflict in the way that later dramatic portrayals of mob life would suggest. He did not appear to experience dissonance between his devotion to his family and his devotion to the outfit. For him, these were simply the two worlds he inhabited, and he inhabited both of them with complete commitment. The organizational loyalties and the familial loyalties were, in his understanding, not fundamentally different in kind. Both were based on obligation, respect, and mutual benefit. This understanding would later produce the most distinctive aspect of his public persona, the genuine, visible pleasure he took in his family. He was, by all accounts, a devoted and engaged father. He attended his children's school events. He was present at family gatherings and holidays. Neighbors in River Forest, the suburb where he would later establish his household, remembered him as a quiet, pleasant man who tended his garden and greeted people on the street. They were, of course, experiencing a performance, but there is reason to believe it was a performance that had become, over decades, largely indistinguishable from the genuine article. The early 1940s brought a crisis to the Chicago outfit that would ultimately create the opportunity for Tony Accardo's greatest advancement. The crisis began with an investigation into the outfit's control of the labor unions that dominated Hollywood's movie industry. The scheme was, in retrospect, both audacious and straightforward. The outfit controlled the leadership of several key Hollywood unions, particularly the Projectionist Union, whose members ran the projection equipment in every movie theater in America. By threatening to shut down movie theaters across the country with a projectionist strike, the outfit had positioned itself to extort millions of dollars from the major Hollywood studios, which were terrified of losing their theatrical revenues. The studios paid. For years they paid. The scheme eventually unraveled, as such schemes always do when they rely on too many people keeping too many secrets. Federal prosecutors built a case against the outfit's leadership, and in 1943 the indictments came down. Among those charged were Paul the Waiter Ricca, Capone's longtime confidant and one of the most senior figures in the organization, and several other top outfit men. Frank Nitti, the nominal boss, faced a particularly difficult situation. He knew he would be convicted. He knew he would be sentenced to significant prison time. And he knew, because he had done time before, that he was profoundly claustrophobic, a condition that made the prospect of years in a federal penitentiary genuinely intolerable rather than merely unpleasant. On March 19, 1943, Nitti walked out to a railroad yard in North Riverside, Illinois, and shot himself 3 times. The third shot was fatal. Frank, the enforcer, Nitti died on his knees against a wire fence, in a position so awkward that it raised questions for some observers, but the official conclusion was suicide, and suicide it remained. With Nitti dead and Ricca headed to prison, the Chicago outfit needed leadership. The choice fell on Tony Accardo. At 37 years old, he became the day-to-day boss of the most powerful criminal organization in the American Midwest. He had not sought the position to the kind of political maneuvering and backstabbing that characterized leadership transitions in other crime families. He had simply been the most capable man available, and the men around him knew it. Ricca, even in prison, retained tremendous authority and respect within the outfit. Accardo and Ricca would share power in a way that was unusual in organized crime, genuinely collaborative rather than merely nominal, for the better part of 3 decades. But the day-to-day management of the organization, the 1,000 decisions that had to be made on a daily basis, fell to Accardo. The assessment that would come to be most closely associated with Tony Accardo, that he had more brains before breakfast than Al Capone ever had all day, has been attributed to several different sources over the years. The exact speaker is less important than the fact that the sentiment was widely shared among people who knew both men. What distinguished Accardo's intelligence from Capone's was not raw cognitive ability, but something more specifically practical. The understanding that in the organized crime business, as in any other business operating in a competitive and hostile environment, long-term survival depended on making oneself as hard to attack as possible. And the easiest way to make yourself hard to attack was to make yourself invisible. Capone had been magnificent at the business of organized crime while he was operating at the peak of his powers. But he had been unable to resist the temptations of celebrity. He had held press conferences. He had attended sporting events and waved to crowds. He had dressed in expensive suits and distributed money to journalists who wrote flattering stories about him. He had, in short, made himself into a public figure. And public figures, in a democracy with functioning press and an occasional inclination toward law enforcement, were vulnerable in ways that invisible men were not. Accardo internalized this lesson and acted on it throughout his career. He declined public attention with a consistency that became almost pathological. When the 1950 Kefauver Committee, the Senate Special Committee to investigate crime and interstate commerce, subpoenaed him to testify before cameras that would broadcast his face to an estimated 30 million American viewers, he appeared and said almost nothing. He invoked the Fifth Amendment. He gave the committee his name, confirmed his date of birth, and then declined to answer virtually every substantive question put to him. When professional wrestlers Lou Albano and Tony Altamari brought a mafia-themed tag team act called the Sicilians to Chicago in 1961, Accardo personally persuaded them to drop the gimmick, not because it offended his Sicilian heritage, but because any publicity that drew attention to organized crime in Chicago drew attention to him. He claimed to be a beer salesman. When that explanation for his obviously comfortable lifestyle became inadequate, the six-bedroom mansion with the bowling lanes and the indoor swimming pool was not the home of a beer salesman, he sought other explanations. He was eventually forced to downgrade to a smaller ranch house on North Ashland Avenue when the IRS began paying pointed attention to the gap between his stated income and his evident standard of living. But even the smaller house contained a vault. When Tony Accardo assumed effective control of the Chicago outfit in 1943, he inherited an organization that was still primarily operating on a model that Capone had established during Prohibition, heavily relying on illegal gambling, loan sharking, and the various enterprises that had grown up around the bootlegging economy. The bootlegging itself was gone, of course. Prohibition had ended in 1933, but the organizational infrastructure remained, and Accardo set about using it to build something more sophisticated. His first major strategic decision was also his most consequential. He began steering the outfit away from the kinds of criminal enterprises that generated the most public attention and legal exposure, and toward enterprises that could be conducted with more discretion and greater profitability. Labor, racketeering, and extortion, the staples of the Capone era, were progressively phased out, not because Accardo had any principal objection to them, but because they were blunt instruments that attracted prosecutors and headlines in equal measure. What replaced them were operations that could be disguised more effectively as legitimate commerce, or that operated in spaces where law enforcement attention was harder to focus. The slot machine and vending machine business was one of the outfit's most significant expansions under Accardo's direction. He placed slot machines in gas stations, restaurants, and bars throughout the outfit's territory, not merely in Chicago proper, but across a vast swath of the American Midwest, including northern Indiana, southern Wisconsin, and Iowa. The machines generated steady, reliable revenue that was difficult to trace precisely because it flowed through hundreds of small establishments, each of which was paying a fee. Officially, a rental fee for machines that was in practice a tribute to the outfit. He moved the outfit aggressively into counterfeiting operations, fake cigarette and liquor tax stamps that allowed untaxed goods to be sold at profit, and into an expansion of narcotics smuggling that would later become a source of significant internal controversy within the organization. He took over the wire services that relayed racing results to bookmakers across the country, giving the outfit a chokehold on a nationwide bookmaking operation that generated enormous profits with minimal visible criminal exposure. He also converted the outfit's prostitution operations, previously conducted through brothels that were relatively easy targets for law enforcement, into call-girl services that were harder to identify and prosecute. This was the kind of modernization that characterized Accardo's approach. Not the elimination of criminal enterprises, but their evolution into forms that were more resilient and profitable. Paul Ricca, observing all this from the sidelines of his enforced semi-retirement. He had been released from prison in 1947 through what many observers described as a miracle of political connection, a feat accomplished largely through the work of the outfit's brilliant fixer Murray, the Camel Humphreys, remarked that Accardo had more brains for breakfast than Capone had in a lifetime. It was the highest compliment one Chicago mob veteran could pay to another, and it was paid with the sincerity of a man who had known both subjects personally. One of the less discussed aspects of Tony Accardo's leadership was his management of the Chicago outfit's relationships with the other major American crime families, the 5 New York families, the Philadelphia organization, the Detroit combination, the Milwaukee and Kansas City operations, and the various other regional groups that together constituted what was called the National Commission or La Cosa Nostra. The Commission was a coordinating body that had been established in 1931, following the end of the violent Castellammarese War in New York, to resolve disputes between families and prevent the kind of destructive internecine conflict that had cost the underworld enormous amounts of money and personnel. It operated on a principle of mutual recognition. Each family's territorial rights were acknowledged by the others, and disputes would be resolved in negotiation rather than warfare. Accardo understood the system intuitively and used effectively. He was never a man who sought dominance over the other families. He had no desire to be a boss of bosses, in the way that some New York figures had aspired to that position. What he wanted was for the Chicago outfit to operate without interference and to profit from a national crime infrastructure without attracting unnecessary attention. He cultivated relationships with other bosses based on mutual benefit, rather than on the kind of status competition that drove some of his contemporaries. His relationship with Meyer Lansky, the financial genius of American organized crime, a Jewish mobster who operated in the interstices between the Italian-American families and provided financial services and Las Vegas connections to all of them, was particularly important. Accardo and Lansky shared a philosophy about the business of crime. It was a business, governed by business logic, and the men who ran it most successfully were those who kept their egos subordinate to their balance sheets. The Appalachian meeting of November 1957 was a test of this understanding. The meeting, held at the estate of mob figure Joseph Barber in the small town of Appalachian in upstate New York, was intended to bring together the leadership of American organized crime to resolve several outstanding disputes, including questions of territory and succession following several high-profile murders. Accardo was aware of the meeting. Some sources suggest that he and his associates were responsible for changing the venue from Chicago, where an IRS investigation into Accardo's finances was making the city uncomfortably hot that particular November. The decision to move the meeting to Appalachian proved fateful. State Trooper Edgar Croswell, who had been watching the Barber estate with mounting suspicion, organized a roadblock when he saw luxury cars with out-of-state plates converging on the property. When word reached the men inside that police were outside, panic erupted. 60 mobsters were caught. Dozens more escaped through the woods in their expensive suits and shoes. Tony Accardo was not among those caught. He had maintained his trademark absence from proceedings that might expose him to legal risk, and he was nowhere near Appalachian on November 14, 1957. The fallout from the Appalachian disaster was enormous. It forced the FBI, which had spent years publicly denying the existence of a national organized crime syndicate under the direction of J. Edgar Hoover, to acknowledge the reality that the meeting made undeniable. Hoover created a dedicated organized crime division and launched the Top Hoodlum program, targeting the top figures in each city's crime organization. Tony Accardo was on that list, as he'd been on every law enforcement list of dangerous individuals for 20 years. But being on a list and being successfully prosecuted are different things entirely, and Accardo understood the difference with the clarity of a man who had spent his career studying it. The story of the Chicago outfit in Las Vegas is inseparable from the story of Tony Accardo's greatest strategic achievement. In the post-war years, as Las Vegas transformed itself from a small desert town into a gambling metropolis of unprecedented profitability, the various American crime families competed to establish their presence. The New York families, particularly the Genovese and Gambino organizations, assumed that their size and traditional dominance of American organized crime would give them the advantage. They were wrong. Tony Accardo and Paul Ricca had recognized the potential of Las Vegas early, when most organized crime figures were still focused primarily on the established markets of the eastern cities. They had made early investments in Nevada casino ventures, established relationships with casino operators who needed both capital and protection, and built the organizational infrastructure that would allow the Chicago outfit to dominate Las Vegas gaming for decades. The key instrument of this dominance was money, specifically money from the Teamsters Union's Central States Pension Fund. Jimmy Hoffa, the Teamsters president, had created this pension fund in 1955, and under his direction it became what was effectively the mob's personal bank for Las Vegas casino construction. When Hoffa went to prison in 1967, Alan Dorfman, a man closely connected to the Chicago outfit, assumed effective control over the pension fund's investment decisions, ensuring that the money continued to flow to mob-connected casino ventures. The most elaborate and profitable of these ventures was a scheme involving Alan Glick's Argent Corporation. Glick, a San Diego real estate developer with a clean criminal record, obtained approximately $146 million in loans from the Central States Pension Fund. Loans facilitated by the combined influence of the Chicago, Milwaukee, Kansas City, and Cleveland families over various union trustees. Glick used this money to purchase 4 Las Vegas casino hotels: the Stardust, the Fremont, the Hacienda, and the Marina. Officially, these were Glick's properties. In reality, they were controlled by the mob, and the mob's chosen instrument for managing them was a man named Frank Lefty Rosenthal. Rosenthal, the basis for the Robert De Niro character in Martin Scorsese's 1995 film Casino, was a legendary sports bettor and handicapper who had no casino license from Nevada gaming regulators, who were suspicious of his organized crime connections. He was installed in a management position at the Stardust and effectively ran the casino operation, ensuring that the skim, the removal of cash from casino revenues before any official counting took place, continued efficiently and profitably. The skim was the genius of the whole operation. Money removed before it was officially counted didn't appear on any ledger. It couldn't be taxed. It couldn't be traced through normal financial investigation. It was, in the simplest possible terms, free money. Hundreds of thousands of dollars per week flowing from the Las Vegas casino floors to mob couriers who transported it back to Chicago, where it was distributed among the participating families. The Chicago outfit received 25% of the action, and Tony Accardo and Joey Iappa, who served as the street boss overseeing Chicago's Las Vegas operations, presided over a river of untaxed cash that funded the outfit's activities for years. The Stardust slot manager, Jay Vandermark, oversaw one particularly creative dimension of the operation, using manipulated scales to miscount coins. He orchestrated a scheme that is estimated to have removed between $7 and $15 million from the casino between 1974 and 1976. When state gaming investigators began closing in, Vandermark disappeared in 1976. His body was never found. To protect Rosenthal and the outfit's investment, Accardo had dispatched Anthony "Tony the Ant" Spilatro to Las Vegas in 1971. Spilatro, a brilliant, psychopathic enforcer who had grown up in Chicago's mob world and who was responsible for an estimated 24 murders, was supposed to keep a low profile while ensuring that nothing threatened the lucrative skim operation. Instead, Spilatro formed a burglary crew, dated Rosenthal's wife, and engaged in behavior so flagrantly violent and publicly visible that he became a liability rather than an asset. But that is a later chapter in the story. What mattered in the early 1970s was that the Chicago outfit, under Accardo's strategic direction, had achieved something extraordinary. They had established effective control over the Las Vegas gaming industry, taking that prize away from the New York families. In 1950 and 1951, Senator Estes Kefauver of Tennessee chaired the special committee to investigate crime in interstate commerce, which conducted televised hearings that became a national sensation. More than 600 witnesses testified. Schools dismissed students to watch the broadcasts. Blood donation centers reported drops in donations as Americans stayed home to watch the proceedings. Life magazine described it as an event in which never before had the attention of the nation been riveted so completely on a single matter. Tony Accardo was among the witnesses called before the Kefauver committee. He appeared as required. He sat before the cameras with the composed, watchful expression of a man who has spent years studying how to remain unreadable. When senators asked him about his income, he deflected. When they asked about his criminal associations, he invoked the Fifth Amendment. When they asked about specific criminal enterprises, He invoked the Fifth Amendment again. He acknowledged his name and his date of birth, and essentially nothing else of substance. The performance was masterful. Frank Costello, the New York boss who appeared before the committee, became famous for his nervous hands. The cameras, at his request, showed only his hands rather than his face, and those hands, crumpling and smoothing a handkerchief, told the audience everything they needed to know about the internal state of a powerful man under pressure. Accardo gave the cameras nothing. His hands were still. His face was composed. He was, to all external appearances, a man who had nothing to hide because he had nothing to acknowledge. He left the hearing room, having given the committee essentially nothing usable, and having given their television audience a portrait of mob stoicism that would be studied by organized crime figures for years afterward. The Kefauver hearings marked the beginning of a new era of federal attention to organized crime, and Tony Accardo understood that the landscape had changed. The FBI under Hoover might continue to officially deny the existence of a national crime syndicate, but individual investigations were intensifying. Electronic surveillance was becoming more sophisticated, and the possibility of using tax laws against criminal income, the strategy that had brought down Capone, was being aggressively revisited. His response to this changing environment was characteristically strategic. He retreated even further from any position that could be described as official leadership. In 1957, with the IRS paying uncomfortably pointed attention to his financial affairs, and with the post-Appalachian scrutiny making the formal position of boss untenable for anyone who wished to avoid prosecution, Tony Accardo made a decision that was either an act of genius or a supremely successful piece of theater, depending on how you look at it. He stepped down as boss, or rather, he stepped aside from the title while retaining every iota of the actual authority that the title represented. The man installed as a public-facing boss of the Chicago outfit was Sam Giancana, a flamboyant, hot-tempered, and charismatic figure who had risen through the organization's ranks to become one of its most capable street operators. Giancana was everything that Accardo deliberately was not: visible, publicity-loving, socially ambitious in a way that drew him into the orbit of celebrities and politicians, and, eventually, into a relationship with the CIA that would have consequences extending far beyond the organized crime world. The arrangement was clear to everyone within the outfit. Giancana ran day-to-day operations, but he cleared all major decisions, and certainly all murders, with Accardo and Ricca. The outfit's men understood that their actual boss was a man who had made himself invisible, not the man who was appearing in nightclubs and dating entertainer Phyllis McGuire, and courting the kind of social prominence that Accardo had spent his entire career avoiding. Accardo took the title of consigliere, counselor, which in the formal organizational structure of the Mafia was a senior advisory role rather than a command position. In practice, his authority was undiminished. When Giancana wanted to undertake a significant new venture, or when a dispute arose that required the kind of final adjudication that only the organization's most senior figure could provide, it was Accardo he consulted. When murders needed to be sanctioned, and in the world of organized crime, murders always required sanction from above, it was Accardo's approval that made the decision final. This arrangement had additional benefits beyond personal insulation from prosecution. By placing others in the visible leadership positions, Accardo created a human buffer between himself and the consequences of the organization's activities. When federal prosecutors built cases, they typically targeted the men who were most visibly associated with the outfit's crimes, the bosses of record, the public-facing figures. Accardo, by maintaining his invisible authority, remained a step removed from the prosecutorial focus. Former FBI agent William F. Romer Jr., who spent years tracking Accardo and wrote the most comprehensive biography of him, titled simply Accardo, the genuine godfather, described the frustration of watching a man he was absolutely certain was guilty of the most serious crimes escape prosecution year after year after year. Romer could not charge him. He could not put together evidence that would survive a courtroom. He could build files inches thick documenting Accardo's associations, his financial dealings, his movements, the conversations his colleagues had about him. But Accardo himself remained behind a wall of careful distance that the available evidence could not breach. Sam Giancana was, in many ways, everything that Tony Accardo had spent his career refusing to be. Where Accardo was disciplined, Giancana was impulsive. Where Accardo was invisible, Giancana was relentlessly visible. where Accardo compartmentalized criminal life from his family life with absolute discipline. Giancana blurred those lines to the point of recklessness, and where Accardo understood that the fundamental goal of a successful organized crime figure was to generate wealth while avoiding prosecution, Giancana seemed at times more interested in status and notoriety than in the careful accumulation of power. The relationship between the two men, mentor and protege, boss and subordinate, and eventually reluctant adversary, is one of the central human stories in the history of the Chicago outfit. Giancana had grown up in the same world as Accardo, coming to the 42 Gang, a notoriously violent Chicago street gang that served as yet another feeder system for the outfit. He was capable, ruthless, and genuinely charismatic in a way that made him effective both as a street operator and later as a public-facing boss. He oversaw the outfit's numbers rackets in Chicago's black communities, was a key figure in the Las Vegas casino operations, and managed relationships with national political figures that were extraordinary in their scope. The relationship with the Kennedy family is perhaps the most dramatic aspect of Giancana's career. During the 1960 presidential election, the Chicago outfit under Giancana's operational direction is widely believed to have provided significant assistance to John F. Kennedy's campaign, primarily through Union muscle that delivered votes in key precincts. The quid pro quo that a Kennedy administration would ease federal pressure on organized crime never materialized. Instead, the administration of Attorney General Robert Kennedy became the most aggressive federal anti-mob campaign in American history. Giancana was also recruited by the CIA to assist in plots to assassinate Cuban leader Fidel Castro, a bizarre chapter that connected the American mob to the highest levels of American intelligence at the height of the Cold War. The plots, which involved poison pills and various other schemes that might have been invented by a frustrated thriller novelist, never succeeded. What they did succeed in doing was creating an extraordinary degree of mutual compromise between the CIA and the organized crime figures it had recruited, a compromise that would generate speculation and conspiracy theories for decades. But what finally brought the relationship between Accardo and Giancana to its breaking point was simpler and more mundane than any of this. Giancana was embarrassing the organization. He dated Phyllis McGuire, a member of the popular singing group the McGuire Sisters, publicly and ostentatiously. The FBI, which now, in the post-Appalachian era, was paying dedicated attention to organized crime, followed Giancana's car through Chicago suburbs in motorcades that became almost comically visible. He refused to distribute casino profits fairly among the organization's members. He made scenes in public and behaved in ways that drew attention to the outfit at a moment when Accardo was doing everything possible to reduce that attention. Around 1966, after Giancana spent a year in jail on federal contempt of court charges, Accardo and Ricca had had enough. Giancana was replaced with Joey Iuppa as street boss and essentially exiled from Chicago. He spent years in Mexico, was eventually expelled from that country under circumstances that were themselves murky, and returned to Chicago in 1974 to find that his position in the outfit was gone and that he was regarded by many of his former colleagues as a liability. On a June night in 1975, Giancana was cooking Italian sausages and escarole in the basement apartment of his Oak Park home when someone he admitted through the door shot him 7 times in the head and neck with a .22 caliber pistol equipped with a silencer, a classic outfit murder weapon, a classic outfit methodology. He was scheduled to appear before a congressional committee the following day to testify about the CIA mob connection. He never testified. Who ordered Sam Giancana's murder has been debated ever since. The evidence does not lead definitively to Accardo, but nothing of that magnitude happened in Chicago without Accardo's knowledge, and almost certainly without his approval. The house at 915 Franklin Avenue in River Forest, Illinois, is a physical monument to Tony Accardo's paradoxical life. A palace built by a man who claimed to be a beer salesman, a fortress occupied by a family man whose business was organized crime. Accardo purchased the property in 1951, paying a reported $125,000 for a Tudor mansion that had been built in 1929 by William Grunow, a radio pioneer who had manufactured the majestic brand of radios. The house was extraordinary by any measure. 24 rooms set within approximately 22,000 square feet, clad in brick and stone with copper details, fronted by an asymmetrical facade in the English Tudor style. A 7-foot-high black iron fence with gold accents surrounded the property, and 2 electronic gates controlled access. The interior was something else entirely. There was a regulation-sized bowling alley. 2 lanes, actually. There was an English pub with hand-carved and polychrome beamed ceilings, and seating for 50 people, complete with a full antique bar. There was an indoor swimming pool lined with blue-glazed Mexican tiles. There was a mahogany library behind a beautifully curved raised panel door. There was a sprawling staircase in the foyer and multiple large fireplaces. There was a pipe organ. The house contained, in short, every luxury that its occupant could desire, and it had been furnished and decorated with a taste that ran more toward the comfortable and substantial than toward the ostentatious. This was, on its face, an absurd establishment for a man who described himself as a beer salesman. The IRS noticed. The FBI noticed. Chicago newspapers noticed. The gap between the house and the stated income was, even by the standards of an era when mob figures operated with considerable brazenness, remarkable. When the pressure became too intense, Accardo eventually sold the property in 1963 for around $200,000, a tidy profit on his original investment, and relocated to a more modest ranch house on North Ashland Avenue. But he installed a vault in the new house, and the ranch house became the site of many outfit sit-downs, the meetings at which the organization's leadership gathered to discuss business and resolve disputes. The old mansion had already served its primary purpose. It had been the venue for years of outfit gatherings, a place where Accardo could entertain his colleagues in conditions of relative security, behind iron gates in a suburb full of respectable professionals who had no reason to ask questions about their neighbor's occupation. It had been the setting for family Christmases and the children's birthday parties, the Sunday dinners after Mass, and the quiet evenings when Tony Accardo sat in his pub with a drink and worked through the organizational problems of managing a criminal empire that stretched across half a continent, and it had been the site of the most audacious insult of his entire career. January 6, 1978. Tony Accardo was 71 years old, in semi-retirement in terms of his public profile, still absolutely commanding in terms of his actual authority. He was vacationing in California. Some accounts say Florida, some say Palm Springs, when his phone rang with news that would have been comical if its consequences had not been so murderous. Someone had broken into his River Forest home. The immediate backstory was this. In the days before Christmas 1977, a crew of professional burglars led by a man named John Mendel had robbed a jewelry store on Chicago's North Side. The store's owner, Harry Levinson, was a Jewish bookie who paid protection money to the Chicago outfit. Levinson called in his marker. Accardo sent word to Mendel, return the stolen goods. Mendel and his crew reluctantly obeyed. The merchandise was returned to Accardo's house, where, presumably, it sat in that vault on North Ashland Avenue, waiting to be returned to its rightful owner. Mendel and his crew were furious. They felt they had been robbed of their score by an organization that had no claim on their specific criminal enterprise. And so they made the decision that would define the remainder of their lives, most of which would be measured in weeks. They decided to rob Tony Accardo. This was not merely dangerous. It was, in the context of Chicago organized crime, an act so staggeringly ill-advised that it approaches the metaphysical. Accardo's home was not merely his private residence. It was a symbol of everything the outfit stood for. Its inviolability was not just practical, it was foundational. You did not touch the boss's house. You did not take what belonged to the boss. These were not written rules. They did not need to be written. They were understood with the same unspoken certainty with which people understand that you do not reach into a lion's cage. Mendel and at least one other crew member entered the River Forest property in the early morning hours of January 6, 1978. What they took, jewelry, cash, and other valuables, is estimated at $1 million. Whether they actually recovered the items that had been confiscated from them or simply helped themselves to whatever else was available is not entirely clear. The Chicago police investigated when they learned of the burglary, but Accardo declined to cooperate, as was his invariable practice with law enforcement. What happened next demonstrated, with graphic finality, why Tony Accardo's authority was not merely a matter of organizational status, but a force of nature that could not be questioned without fatal consequences. The killings began within days. John Mendel himself was the first to disappear. He had been running from pillar to post, as one investigator described it, attempting to stay one step ahead of what he surely understood was coming. His body surfaced 6 weeks later, in the trunk of an Oldsmobile abandoned on Chicago's South Side. His arms had been bound, his neck had been slashed, and in a detail so deliberately theatrical that it could only have been designed to send a message, a rope had been tied around his throat near the wound to slow the bleeding, so that he would live long enough to watch himself die. Bernard Buddy Ryan, Mendel's second-in-command, was found shot 4 times in the back of the head in the driver's seat of a car in suburban Stone Park on January 20th, 10 days after the burglary. Steve Garcia, another crew member, was found in the trunk of a car in the parking lot of Sheraton Hotel near O'Hare International Airport on February 2nd. On February 4th, Vince Moretti, the crew's fence, the man who handled their stolen property, was lured with a small-time criminal friend named Don Reno to a bar in Cicero, Illinois. Moretti and Reno were beaten and stomped to death on the bar floor, while the jukebox played Johnny Mathis's Strangers in the Night. Moretti had made the additional error of being seen around town, wearing Accardo's solid gold cufflinks, which he had apparently helped himself to along with everything else. Reno had no connection to the burglary. He simply happened to be present, and that was enough. Bobby Hertogs was found in the trunk of his car on April 6th, badly beaten with his throat slit. Johnny McDonald was shot in the back of the head and dumped in an alley on April 14th. Then, to cover his tracks, Accardo turned on the men he had sent to carry out the killings. Anthony Little Tony Borsellino and Gerald Jerry the Dinger Caruzello, 2 of the triggermen from a wild bunch, the outfit elite enforcement crew, were themselves shot in the back of the head and disposed of. The housekeeper, a Sicilian-born man named Michael Volpe, disappeared after testifying before a grand jury and has never been found. His eyeglasses were discovered later in a safe inside the residence during a police raid. 10 killings in total. Every single one of them unsolved. Nobody ever arrested, nobody ever charged. In the Time magazine story about the episode, published in August 1978, one investigator offered a description of the scene that has stayed in the record. When federal agents searching the house of a burglary associate found evidence of the skim and confronted the man, they could see the confidence drain out of him as he realized that everything was over. Nobody who knew Tony Accardo was surprised by any of it. The only surprise was the audacity of the burglars. And that surprise was, as one observer noted at the time, a short-lived one. FBI Special Agent William F. Romer Jr. spent years of his career trying to put Tony Accardo in prison. He set up listening devices in the social clubs where outfit members gathered. He followed Accardo's movements. He cultivated informants within the organization. He read thousands of pages of surveillance transcripts and attended dozens of grand jury proceedings. He wrote reports and memoranda and case summaries. And at the end of all of it, after a career dedicated in substantial part to pursuit of one man, he was unable to obtain a conviction. Later in life, Roma would write the most comprehensive biographical account of Accardo ever published, titled Accardo, the Genuine Godfather, and in it he described the frustration and the grudging respect that came from spending years in close proximity, professionally speaking, to a man of Accardo's formidable intelligence. He had, Roma wrote, more brains before breakfast than virtually anyone else he had encountered in decades of fighting organized crime. The FBI's tactics evolved over the decades in response to the challenge posed by men like Accardo. The development of electronic surveillance, bugs planted in the back rooms of restaurants and social clubs, wiretaps on telephones, produced transcripts of extraordinary richness. But Accardo had long since learned the discipline of conducting his most sensitive conversations face-to-face, in open spaces or in his car, where listening devices were harder to plant and harder to maintain. The development of the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO, in 1970 represented a fundamental shift in federal anti-mob strategy. RICO allowed prosecutors to charge an individual not merely with specific criminal acts, but with being part of a pattern of racketeering activity associated with criminal enterprise. This meant that the careful compartmentalization that Accardo had constructed, the layers of intermediaries, the absence of documentary evidence connecting him to specific crimes, became less effective as a shield. Prosecutors could use Rico to argue that his very authority within the organization was itself evidence of his criminal liability. But even Rico, in its early applications, could not quite reach Accardo. By the time the law was being used effectively against mob figures, Accardo had been in genuine semi-retirement for years, and the organizational changes in the outfit meant that building a RICO case against him specifically, against this elderly man who claimed to be a beer salesman and who spent his winters in Palm Springs, was genuinely difficult. The history of the Chicago outfit from the mid-1960s through the late 1980s is, in one sense, a history of the men who sat in the boss's chair while Tony Accardo remained the organization's ultimate authority. Understanding the succession of front bosses requires understanding that their formal positions were largely ceremonial in the sense that counted most. None of them could make significant decisions without Accardo's knowledge and approval. After Giancana was effectively exiled, Joey Iuppa assumed the street boss position. Iuppa, known as Joey Dove for his fondness for dove hunting, a pastime that led to his arrest in Kansas on charges related to the transportation of migratory birds, was a capable and loyal organization man who understood his role clearly. He ran the Chicago street operations efficiently, handled day-to-day management of the outfit's various enterprises, and deferred to Accardo on anything of strategic significance. The organizational structure that Accardo had created was, in its essentials, a separation of operational management from strategic authority. The boss of record handled the day-to-day, the personnel decisions, the collection of tributes, the management of criminal enterprises. Accardo, as consigliere and ultimate authority, handled strategy, major policy decisions, the sanctioning of significant violence, and the management of relationships with other crime families. The system worked because Accardo's authority was so thoroughly established and so completely unquestioned that it required no visible enforcement. People in the outfit knew where the power actually resided. The Las Vegas casino scheme, which reached its peak in the early 1980s under Iuppa's street management and Accardo's strategic direction, eventually unraveled under the sustained pressure of federal investigation. The FBI had placed surveillance on the Stardust Casino and various employees, tracked the movement of cash, and eventually assembled the evidence for what became known as a strawman case, a prosecution of the organized crime figures responsible for the Las Vegas skimming operations. In 1986, Joseph Iuppa and John Cerrone were convicted of skimming Las Vegas casino profits and sentenced to prison. It was the end of an era, the mob's direct control of Las Vegas casino gaming. The empire that Accardo had built over decades, the golden goose that fed the outfit with hundreds of millions of untaxed dollars, was finished. At a meeting in January 1986 at the Czech Lodge in North Riverside, Illinois, Accardo, now 80 years old, frail, battling heart and lung conditions, but still absolutely commanding, appointed Samuel Carlisi as the new street boss. Carlisi told those assembled that Accardo would remain as consigliere and would have the final say on all organizational decisions. Even at 80, even in the wreckage of the Las Vegas empire, even with the FBI closing in on multiple fronts, Tony Accardo was still the boss of the Chicago outfit. He just didn't have the title. Tony Accardo appeared before the United States Senate's Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations 3 times over the course of his career. Each appearance was a masterclass in the practical application of the Fifth Amendment's protection against self-incrimination. The first appearance, before the Kefauver Committee in 1950, has already been described. The subsequent appearances followed the same pattern. Accardo would appear, confirm his identity, listen to questions about his role in organized crime, and decline to answer. He did not become visibly agitated. He did not attempt to deflect or misdirect. He simply declined with a consistency and calm that seemed almost meditative. At his final appearance before the committee in 1984, Accardo was 78 years old. He had spent more than 60 years in organized crime, had presided over Chicago outfit's rise to national dominance, had orchestrated the Las Vegas casino operation, had ordered murders and given his approval to countless criminal enterprises of every conceivable description. He had been investigated by the FBI for decades and had emerged every single time without a conviction that stuck. Before the committee, he was asked the central question that had animated federal prosecutors' ambitions for 40 years. Was he a member or the boss or in any way a leader of the Chicago outfit? "I have no control over any body," Tony Accardo said. It was the most precisely true statement he had ever made in a legal setting. He had no formal control over anybody. He simply had authority, the kind of authority that does not require paperwork or titles or formal mechanisms of enforcement, the kind of authority that exists in people's heads and hearts, in the understanding of what happens when you cross certain lines. He was 80 years old, and he was sitting in front of a Senate subcommittee, and he was telling them the literal truth, and they could not touch him. One of the less examined aspects of Tony Accardo's career is the extent to which, alongside his criminal enterprises, he built a portfolio of legitimate business investments of substantial value. This was not merely a matter of money laundering, of taking dirty money and cleaning it to legitimate commerce, though it was certainly that. It was also a reflection of his understanding that long-term security required legitimate income streams that could be explained to the IRS and to any other interested party. By the time of his death, Accardo's personal holdings included investments in commercial office buildings, retail centers, lumber farms, paper factories, hotels, car dealerships, trucking companies, newspaper companies, restaurants, and travel agencies. These were not trivial investments. They represented, taken together, the kind of diversified business portfolio that a successful corporate executive might have accumulated over a career. Some of this wealth was generated through the straightforward application of the outfit's muscle. Businesses that were persuaded to take on Accardo-connected investors, or that found it advisable to give favorable terms to companies controlled by the outfit's associates. The line between investment and extortion was, in practice, often blurry, but some of it was genuine business acumen. The same qualities that had made Accardo effective as an organizational leader applied to the management of legitimate commercial ventures. The neighbor and personal physician dimension of his life was also carefully managed. His River Forest neighbor, Dr. Jim Cardo, lived across the street in what was known locally as the Mars Candy Mansion, and his similar-sounding surname led to considerable public confusion. Cardo, along with his wife Rose, a nurse, and her brother Leon Kalenko, were rumored to provide Accardo with off-the-books medical care that kept his health matters out of any official record that might be accessed by investigators. The IRS, despite decades of trying, was never able to put together a successful tax case against Accardo. One conviction for tax evasion, secured in 1960 and accompanied by a 6-year prison sentence, was overturned on appeal. The appeals court's reversal of that conviction was one of the most significant moments in Accardo's legal history. Not because it was surprising, but because it demonstrated the depth of his legal team's capability and the difficulty of maintaining successful prosecutions against a man who maintained such careful compartmentalization. The name Big Tuna entered Tony Accardo's biography in 1939 to one of the most absurdly mundane episodes in the history of American organized crime. He had gone on a fishing expedition to Wedgeport, Nova Scotia, Canada. This in itself was not remarkable. Fishing was one of the legitimate leisure activities that mob figures of the era pursued, along with golf, and Accardo was known to be fond of both. What was remarkable was the fish he caught, a tuna weighing approximately 400 pounds, which by any measure was a genuine achievement of recreational deep-sea fishing. A photograph was taken. The photograph was published in Chicago newspapers, and the caption writers, with the creative freedom that their profession occasionally permitted, dubbed him Big Tuna. The name caught on with the press and eventually with the public, creating a curious parallel track to the Joe Batters nickname that his colleagues had used for a decade. The two nicknames illuminate the two sides of the man that most people saw only one of. Joe Batters was a name the outfit knew, the name that carried the specific historical weight of baseball bats and betrayal and the organized application of lethal force. Big Tuna was a name the newspapers used, the name that conjured the image of a portly middle-aged man on a boat in Nova Scotia, holding up a very large fish, grinning at the camera in a way that looked almost respectable. He preferred, when people in the legitimate world addressed him, to be called Tony. It was a name his family used, and he was in the territory of his own family. Whatever approximation of an ordinary husband and father a man in his circumstances could manage to be. Perhaps the most genuinely puzzling aspect of Tony Accardo's character, to those who have studied his life, is the sincerity and consistency of his family devotion. This is not the kind of sentimentality that appears in Hollywood mob movies. The carefully staged scenes of the Godfather bouncing grandchildren on his knee while discussing murder at the dinner table. Those scenes capture something real, but they also distort it to the lens of dramatic irony that the audience possesses and the characters don't. Accardo's family life appears, from the available evidence, to have been genuinely important to him in a way that was not primarily instrumental. He was not merely performing domesticity as a cover for criminality. He appears to have found in his marriage to Clarice, in his children, in the daily rhythms of suburban family life in River Forest and later Barrington Hills, something that he valued for its own sake, something that represented itself apart from the one that authorized murders and managed criminal empires. This is, of course, difficult to reconcile with the rest of what we know about him. The man who ordered 10 killings in response to a burglary of his home. Killings that included an innocent bystander who happened to be in the wrong bar at the wrong time, is not a man whose moral universe allows easy reconciliation with suburban family warmth. But the two things are both true. Both aspects of Tony Accardo were real. The human capacity to partition experience, to be genuinely loving in one context and genuinely murderous in another, without experiencing these as contradictions that require resolution, is one of the more disturbing capabilities of the species, and Accardo exercised it with unusual consistency. Clarice Accardo, for her part, was by all accounts fully aware of what her husband was. She was not a naive woman who had been kept ignorant of the family business. She was a woman who had made her own set of choices, maintained her own dignity within those choices, and raised her children in conditions of extraordinary material comfort that were purchased at a price she understood. She and Tony remained together until her death. He did not take mistresses in the ostentatious way that some of his colleagues did. He was, within the parameters of his world, a faithful husband. The family's Catholic faith was not merely performative. The priest who entered through the rear door of the funeral home in 1992 was a genuine presence in the Accardo family's life, not simply a prop deployed for respectability. Tony Accardo went to Mass, participated in the sacraments, maintained his faith in the manner of many Italian-American Catholics of his generation, with a theology that was perhaps more cultural than doctrinal, but with genuine emotional and spiritual investment nonetheless. How he reconciled that faith with the specific content of his career is a question to which no certain answer is available. He appears not to have spent much time trying to reconcile them. He was a man of his culture, his era, and his world, and that world had its own ethical grammar that was simply different from the grammar of mainstream American moral life. The 1980s were, for the Chicago outfit, the beginning of a long decline that had its roots in decisions made decades earlier and its acceleration in the specific vulnerabilities created by the Las Vegas casino operation. RICO prosecutions, which had become the federal government's primary weapon against organized crime following earlier tests in the 1970s, now began landing with devastating effect on the outfit's leadership. Iappa went to prison. Saron went to prison. Various captains and associates were convicted of a range of charges. The FBI's informant program, developed over decades, was producing testimony from former outfit members who had decided that cooperation with the government offered better prospects than loyalty to an organization that was increasingly unable to protect its own. Accardo, through all of this, remained untouched. He was too old, too remote from day-to-day operations, too carefully insulated by decades of disciplined compartmentalization to be reached by the prosecutions that were consuming those around him. He continued to advise, to be consulted, to weigh in on the questions that required his authority. He traveled between his Barrington Hills home, where he lived with his daughter and son-in-law Ernest Cumero, and his Indian Wells condominium near Palm Springs, where he spent the winter months in the California sun. In 1984, he visited the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, for treatment of serious heart and lung conditions. Shortly after returning home, he fell and suffered a head injury that required hospitalization. His body was failing. In the incremental, grinding way that bodies fail when they reach a certain age and certain conditions, the heart weakening, the lungs becoming less efficient, the physical machinery of a powerful man gradually surrendering to pressures of 80 years. But even in his physical decline, the organizational authority persisted. Even as his body weakened, no significant decision in the Chicago outfit was made without his knowledge, and where he chose to exercise it his approval. He was, as one obituary writer would later observe, chairman of the board until he died. The question of how Tony Accardo managed what no other boss in American organized crime history managed, to die of natural causes, in a hospital bed, at the age of 86, having never served a meaningful prison sentence, does not have a simple answer. It has several answers, each of which is incomplete by itself, but which together describe a genuine phenomenon. The first answer is intelligence. Accardo was, by the consistent testimony of the law enforcement professionals who spent careers studying him, a man of exceptional analytical intelligence. He understood complex systems, the systems of criminal organization, of financial concealment, of legal vulnerability, with the clarity of a natural engineer. He could see the structural weaknesses in a plan and eliminate them before they became prosecutorial opportunities. He understood the logic of evidence in a way that many of his colleagues never did. The second answer is discipline. Intelligence without discipline produces a clever man who talks himself into trouble. Accardo's discipline, his refusal of publicity, his careful compartmentalization, his consistent willingness to let others take the visible positions, was the instrument through which his intelligence was made practical. He never made the mistake of Capone, who let his personality outrun his strategic judgment. He never made the mistake of Giancana, who let his appetite for status and celebrity draw federal attention that eventually destroyed his position. He never made the mistake of John Gotti, who would come 2 generations later and court the press with a brazenness that made his prosecution a national event. The third answer is patience. Accardo was willing to wait. He was willing to let situations develop, to allow problems to resolve themselves over time, to absorb short-term costs in pursuit of long-term stability. In an environment where most criminal figures had the time horizons of gamblers, focused on the next hand, the next score, he thought in decades. The fourth answer is legal preparation. Accardo maintained relationships with the best criminal defense attorneys available. He studied legal processes with the attention that a serious executive gives to the regulatory environment in which his business operates. He understood what prosecutors could and could not prove, what evidence was admissible and what was not, and he structured his conduct accordingly. The fifth answer is, and this is perhaps the most difficult to quantify, something like character. Accardo inspired a loyalty in the men around him that was qualitatively different from the fear-based compliance that characterized the relationships of some other bosses with their subordinates. People did not testify against him not merely because they were afraid of the consequences, but because they genuinely, in some way that defied easy analysis, did not want to betray him. This is a quality that former FBI agent Romer most grudgingly acknowledged, that Accardo had built through decades of consistent conduct, a kind of authority that was based on something more than just the threat of violence. Tony Accardo was not an intellectual. He did not write memoirs or give interviews or articulate a philosophy of criminal life in any formal sense. What he believed can only be inferred from what he did and how he did it. But that inference, drawn across a career of nearly 8 decades, suggests something coherent. He believed in loyalty above almost everything else. The betrayal of loyalty, not loyalty to the law or to the state or to any abstraction, but personal loyalty to the people who depended on you and whom you depended on, was, for Accardo, the one genuinely unforgivable act. This is why the burglary of his home in 1978 produced such a devastating response. It was not merely theft. It was a statement that the obligations of his world could be violated with impunity, and that statement had to be refuted in the only language his world understood. He believed in discipline, not the ascetic, self-denying discipline of a monk, but the practical discipline of a professional who understands that his chosen profession requires certain consistent behaviors. He ate well, dressed well, lived well. He was not indifferent to comfort or pleasure, but he never let those preferences override his strategic judgment. He believed, in a way that was perhaps the most distinctively his own, in the value of invisibility, not because he was naturally shy. By all accounts, he was a warm and engaging presence in social settings where he trusted those around him, but because he had understood, from his earliest years in the outfit, that the men who survived were the men who were hardest to see, and he believed, in some framework that we can only glimpse from a distance, in the legitimacy of his own world. He did not appear to experience his criminal career as a deviation from a better life he should have been living. He was the son of Sicilian immigrants in a city and an era where the traditional paths to advancement education, legitimate employment, professional credentials were not equally available to all. He found his own path, one that matched the particular aptitudes and the opportunities available to him. He pursued it with complete commitment and extraordinary success. Whether that represent a moral indictment or a human tragedy, or simply the story of a man who lived exactly the life he chose to live, that is a judgment each reader must make for themselves. In the last years of his life, Tony Accardo moved between Barrington Hills and Palm Springs with the slow deliberateness of a very old man who has simplified his life down to its essential elements. The organizational empire that had once occupied his every waking hour was still there, reduced from its peak, battered by prosecutions and informants and the changing economics of criminal enterprise, but still functioning, still under his ultimate authority. But it required less of his direct attention than it once had. He lived with his daughter and son-in-law in Barrington Hills, in a setting that was far removed from the Tudor mansion with the bowling lanes and the pipe organ that had defined his middle years. He spent time in his garden. He watched television. He sat in the California sunshine during the winter months. He was visited by men from the organization who came to pay their respects and, occasionally, to seek his counsel on matters that required the judgment of experience. His health had been declining for years. The heart and lung conditions that had brought him to the Mayo Clinic in 1984 had not improved. He was 80 years old, then 82, then 84, then 86, and with each year the physical machinery that had sustained him through 8 decades of extraordinary activity was visibly failing. On May 14, 1992, he was admitted to St. Mary of Nazareth Hospital Center in Chicago. The immediate causes were conditions that had been developing for years: congestive heart failure, acute respiratory failure, pneumonia compounded by chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. He had just returned from his winter stay in Palm Springs, had recently arrived back in the Chicago area at his daughter's home, and then the lungs and the heart could no longer sustain what had been sustaining them. He died at 7:36 in the evening on May 22, 1992. He was 86 years old. 2 days after Tony Accardo's death, a Catholic priest entered through the rear entrance of the Montclair Lucania Funeral Home at 6901 West Belmont Avenue in Chicago. The funeral was private. There was no public procession, no crowd of mourners in the streets, no elaborate ceremony. The man who had been, by the consensus of law enforcement professionals across multiple decades, the most powerful organized crime figure in the United States, was given a send-off that was described by observers as modest. He was buried in a crypt in the mausoleum at Queen of Heaven Cemetery in Hillside, Illinois, the same suburb of Chicago where he had spent so much of his life. The cemetery, associated with the Catholic faith that had been a constant thread through his life, was the appropriate final address for a man who had always preferred to remain in a suburb rather than at the center of attention. The obituaries that appeared in the Chicago Tribune, the New York Times, and papers across the country attempted the difficult task of characterizing a man whose primary defining characteristic was that he had made himself impossible to characterize with evidence. They described his career and his longevity and his immunity to prosecution. They quoted law enforcement officials who confirmed what everyone had always known and no one had ever been able to prove in court. They noted, with the muted irony that the situation demanded, that a man who had spent 60 years in crime had died in a hospital bed of natural causes at the age of 86, having never spent a significant night in prison. The contrast with the deaths of so many of his contemporaries was impossible not to notice. Al Capone had died in 1947, destroyed by the syphilis that had ravaged his mind during his years in federal prison. Frank Nitti had shot himself in a railroad yard. Sam Giancana had been shot in the basement of his own home while cooking dinner. Frank Lefty Rosenthal had narrowly survived a car bombing in Las Vegas. Anthony Spilatro had been beaten to death in a basement in Bensonville, Illinois, buried in a field, and later dug up by the FBI. The roster of violent and ignominious deaths among Accardo's colleagues and associates was long. Tony Accardo died of old age. The legacy of Tony Accardo operates on 3 levels, each distinct from the others, but all ultimately connected. The first level is the organizational legacy, what the Chicago outfit was and became because of his leadership. The outfit that Accardo inherited in 1943 was a bootlegging-era organization that had survived Prohibition's end and was struggling to adapt. The outfit he shaped over the following decades was something fundamentally more sophisticated. A diversified criminal enterprise with national reach, legitimate business holdings, political connections extending to highest levels of government, and an organizational structure sophisticated enough to survive the removal of any individual leader. He transformed the gang into something that had at least some of the characteristics of an institution. The methods he developed, the strategic retreat from headline-generating activities, the expansion into less visible but highly profitable enterprises, the layering of frontmen and intermediaries between the organization's actual leadership and its operations, became the model studied by organized crime organizations across the country. When people speak of the professionalization of American organized crime in the post-war decades, they are speaking in large part of the approach that Tony Accardo pioneered in Chicago and that other organizations observed and adopted. The second level is a legal legacy. The impact of his career on the development of federal law enforcement and anti-organized crime statutes. The Kefauver Committee hearings, which were shaped in part by the challenge of investigating men like Accardo, led directly to the creation of the Organized Crime Section of the Justice Department and to the eventual passage of the RICO Act in 1970. The FBI's Top Hoodlum program, launched after Appalachian, was designed specifically to target men of Accardo's type. The gradual development of more sophisticated electronic surveillance techniques, of financial investigation methods, of witness protection programs for cooperating witnesses, all of these were responses, at least in part, to the specific challenges posed by the kind of organizational architecture that Accardo had built. The irony is considerable. Tony Accardo's success at evading prosecution contributed directly to the development of the legal tools that, in the generation after his death, would be used to dismantle the organization he had built. He won every battle he personally fought. The war, in the longer term, went the other way. The third level is a cultural legacy. What Tony Accardo represents in the American imagination of organized crime. He is less famous than Al Capone, less cinematic than John Gotti, less mythologized than Lucky Luciano. This is partly because he succeeded more completely than any of those men in keeping himself out of public view. It is also because the quality that most defined him, strategic patience, the willingness to remain invisible, the preference for the long game over the immediate gratification of public recognition, is not the quality that makes compelling popular mythology. We tend to mythologize the loud and the dramatic, not the disciplined and the quiet. But those who study organized crime most carefully, law enforcement professionals, criminologists, historians, tend to agree that Accardo was the most significant figure in 20th century American organized crime precisely because of the qualities that make him the least dramatic. He did more with less noise for longer than anyone else who played the game. When the FBI's organized crime investigators looked back on Tony Accardo's career in the years after his death, what they found was a record that combined admiration with frustration in roughly equal measure. Agent after agent who had worked organized crime cases in Chicago spoke of Accardo not with the casual contempt that law enforcement sometimes deploys toward criminal subjects, but with a grudging recognition of genuine talent. William Romer, who had dedicated more years to the pursuit of Accardo than anyone else in federal law enforcement, spoke openly about this in his later years. He said, spent his career trying to put away a man he considered genuinely dangerous, a man he believed had authorized murders and presided over criminal enterprises that had caused real suffering to real people. And he had failed. Not because the evidence didn't exist, not because justice was fundamentally unavailable, but because the man he was pursuing was simply better at his specific form of the game than Romer was at his. Accardo had more brains before breakfast than Capone ever had all day. Paul Ricca had said it first, but Romer might have said it last. The lesson that federal law enforcement drew from Accardo's career was that the organizational form of crime he represented required organizational responses, that targeting individual leaders was insufficient when the organization itself was structured to survive the loss of any individual. This lesson, eventually absorbed and acted on through the systematic application of RICO and the development of comprehensive informant programs, ultimately produced the prosecutorial successes of the 1980s and 1990s that significantly degraded the Chicago outfit and the other major crime families. But those successes came after Tony Accardo's death. In the great contest of his own lifetime, he won. Chicago remembers Tony Accardo in curious ways. The mansion at 915 Franklin Avenue in River Forest has changed hands multiple times since Accardo's ownership. As recently as October 2025, it was listed for sale at $5 million, a price that represented a record for the suburb. The real estate listing described it as a landmark home layered with history, with its hand-carved beam ceilings and bowling alley and indoor pool. Buyers toured the property and imagined what it had been like when the outfit's leadership gathered there for Sunday dinners, when the bosses of Chicago's criminal world sat in the English pub with its 50-seat bar and discussed the management of an empire. The streets of Chicago that Tony Accardo walked as a young man, the streets of Little Sicily, the near West Side, the pool halls and social clubs and back rooms of Prohibition-era Chicago have been transformed almost beyond recognition by the forces of urban development and demographic change. The immigrant community that produced them is long gone, replaced by other immigrant communities, other layers of urban history. But the city itself retains, in the particular quality of its ambition and its tolerance for the blurring of lines between legitimate and illegitimate commerce, something of the character that made it possible for a shoemaker's son from Castelvetrano, Sicily, to become the most powerful criminal figure in American history. The Chicago Crime Commission, which had placed Accardo on its public enemies list throughout his career, eventually acknowledged, with the kind of backhanded tribute that organizations give to adversaries they have spent decades pursuing without success, that he represented a category of criminal leadership that had no real precedent and no easy successor. The verdict of history, insofar as history has rendered one, is that Tony Accardo was extraordinary, extraordinarily capable, extraordinarily disciplined, extraordinarily successful in the specific terms by which his world measured success. Whether that extraordinary capability was deployed in service of something that deserves any admiration beyond the purely technical is a different question, one that requires a reckoning with the suffering that the organization he led caused, the lives it distorted or ended, the communities it exploited, the political processes it corrupted. That reckoning is part of the legacy, too. You cannot tell this story honestly without acknowledging that the invisible empire Tony Accardo built was an empire built on violence and extortion, and the exploitation of human weakness, that the profits it generated came at the expense of real people who were cheated and coerced and sometimes killed. The discipline and the intelligence and the strategic genius were instruments of harm, however much they might be admired in isolation. But the full picture, the harm and the achievement both, is what history demands. And the full picture of Tony Accardo is remarkable by any measure. May 22nd, 1992. The streets of Chicago are exactly as they always have been at that hour of a spring evening. The lake wind coming in from the east, the traffic on the expressways beginning to thin, the city making the transition from the business of the day to the business of the night. In a hospital room on the west side, an old man is dying. He has been dying for 2 weeks. He has been dying, in a slower sense, for years. He does not die dramatically. He does not utter last words of consequence. He does not make a final gesture or a final statement. He simply stops at 7:36 in the evening, and the machinery of his extraordinary life concludes its 8 decades of operation. The nursing supervisor who speaks to the press reports congestive heart failure, acute respiratory failure, pneumonia, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. Medical language for the simple fact that a very old man's body has finally given out. The causes of death are filed on official forms, and the forms are placed in files, and the files become part of a record. What the record cannot contain is the full weight of what has ended. The FBI agents who have spent years building files on this man, some of them now retired, some of them still active, all of them aware of the news, feel something complicated. Relief, perhaps, a sense of conclusion. The particular feeling that comes when a pursuit ends not with an arrest, but with the natural passage of time. The men of the Chicago outfit, those who are still alive, those who are not in prison, those who have not cooperated with the government, feel something different. They feel the specific gravity of the ending of an era, the understanding that what comes after will be something smaller, something less. Paul Ricca had died in 1972 and left a gap that Accardo had filled through sheer force of sustained presence. Now Accardo was gone, and there was no one to fill what he left behind. Chicago, as it always does, goes on. The restaurants open and close. The lake changes color with the light. The sports teams win and lose. The political machinery turns. The streets that once ran with bootleg whiskey and with blood run now with the ordinary commerce of a very large city. But somewhere in the city's memory, in a particular understanding of how power and loyalty and violence have always braided together in this extraordinary place, the ghost of Tony Accardo persists, not in the romantic sense of a ghost, not as mythology or legend, but as a fact of history that is difficult to overstate and impossible to fully comprehend. He came from nothing. He built an empire from a particular combination of ruthlessness and intelligence and patience that his world required. He held that empire together through decades of federal assault and internal disorder and the simple passage of time. He protected himself so thoroughly and so consistently that the law could never lay its full hand on him. And then he died in a hospital bed, surrounded by family of old age. No gangster in American history did more. No gangster in American history survived longer. No gangster in American history was more elusive to the law that pursued him, more loyal to the organization that depended on him, or more comprehensively successful in the specific terms of his chosen profession. Antonino Leonardo Accardo, Joe Batters, the Big Tuna, born in Chicago, April 28, 1906. Died in Chicago, May 22, 1992. Never convicted of a serious crime. Never spent a meaningful night in prison. Never, until the very end, stopped being exactly what it had always been. The last great dawn of Chicago. The streets are quiet now, but they remember. And so ends the story of Tony Accardo, a man who lived by the shadows and died in his sleep, peacefully, surrounded by family. In a world where gangsters typically met violent ends, Big Tuna wrote his own rules until the very end. What did you think of Tony's story? Did it surprise you how different he was from the Hollywood gangster stereotype? Let me know in the comments. I read every single one, especially the late-night thoughts you share. If this story kept you company through the night, show it some love with a like and share it with someone who appreciates real crime history. And if you haven't already, subscribe for more stories like this. Until then, stay curious, stay safe, and sweet dreams. The streets of Chicago are quiet now, but their stories live on in whispers.